Welcome to Hosea. Hosea was the other one of the writing prophets who ministered to the north. We've already taken a look at Amos, and now we're going to talk a little bit about his contemporary Hosea. As we continue today, I would like you to have a couple of items open in front of you. One, again, is going to be your Bible as usual. And then secondly, I would also like you again to have with you that timeline of the kings and prophets in Israel and Mesopotamia that we have been looking at. If you look at that timeline, you're going to notice that there is some overlap between Amos and Hosea, although those dates are only approximate, so we don't know for sure exactly when they were engaging in their ministry. What they have in common, again, is that they were both talking to the northern kingdom. However, neither one mentions the other. So we don't know for sure whether they would have encountered one another or not. We're going to see as we proceed today that their messages are fairly different. Amos was concerned largely about how the people in the society were treating each other, kind of the social fabric of the nation, and how they were not living the kind of life as a nation that would be expected of God's covenant people who had been saved by God. Hosea, on the other hand, is going to talk more directly about religious matters and particularly about the infidelity of people toward Yahweh and their tendency to break that all important command of the covenant that Yahweh is to be their only God. I would like to take a look at two things in particular as I divide up my remarks today. First, we're going to take a look at the historical background of Hosea and kind of pick up where we left off in our lecture on Amos. And then, secondly, we'll go on and talk about the message of Hosea. So in terms of historical background, we are thinking here about the last years of the northern kingdom. Things are rapidly coming to a close. You will remember that as we talked about Amos, we said that the first half of the 8th century was a fairly peaceful time for Israel and Judah, that the Assyrians were not campaigning as actively to the west during this period of time. They were not as much of a threat to Israel and the nations around it, and that is what allowed Israel the time to prosper economically, finally leading to the abuses that Amos is going to be criticizing. However, in 745 BC, Tiglath-Pileser is going to come to the throne of Assyria, and you will see his name mentioned in the right-hand column on your handout. As soon as Tiglath-Pileser comes to the throne, he is once again going to start campaigning very actively towards the west, trying to increase the scope of Assyria's power and influence significantly. This is going to be a time of utter panic and chaos for both Israel and Judah as they are constantly trying to figure out what to do to keep themselves safe from this onslaught. And so it's probably during part of this time of chaos that Hosea is engaged in his ministry. On the sheet, you'll notice that there are going to be a series of kings that are going to last a short amount of time in the midst of all this confusion leading up to the end of the northern kingdom. First of all, the king Zechariah is going to last only for about a year before he is going to be assassinated by Shallum. Shallum, in turn, is going to rule for 1 month, and then he is going to be assassinated by Menachem. Menachem then is going to end up paying tribute to Tiglath-Pileser and is going to become his vassal. He took money from wealthy landowners in order to have the funds to pay off this tribute, probably from the wealth that these people had gained during that time before 745. And so a lot of these people that had gotten wealthy and were misusing their wealth, as Amos was criticizing them for, probably ended up losing that in order to pay Tiglath-Pileser not to come and destroy them. So it is during this time then that the Assyrian resurgence under Tiglath-Pileser is going to begin and continue. His military campaigns are going to start again. And what Tiglath-Pileser is going to do is going to seek not just tribute from other nations, but also active conquering as well. And so this paying of tribute to him is only going to be a temporary fix because in the end, what he wants is to control territory and annex it to his kingdom. After Menachem, he's going to be succeeded by his son Pekahiah, who will only be on the throne for about a year. And Pekahiah is going to be assassinated probably for political reasons by people who do not like his policy of appeasement towards the Assyrians. And following him on the throne is going to be Pekah, who will reign for about 5 years. Once again, Tiglath-Pileser is going to be active during the time of Pekah, and he's going to be moving further into Israel. This is the time about when we're going to have the Syro-Ephraimite crisis that we will read about in the book of Isaiah. And it is in 732 that Damascus, the capital of Syria, is going to fall to the Assyrians. And so, again, the Assyrians just continue their push, continue their march during this whole time, and cause problems for Israel and Judah. Finally, Hosea is going to be the last king of the northern kingdom. He will be reigning from 732 to 722. At first, he is going to send tribute to Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king, to try to keep them from harassing him so much and destroying him. Later on, Hosea is going to appeal to Egypt for help. You might remember that early on in the course we mentioned that Israel is located in a very strategic position right on the main travel routes between Mesopotamia and Egypt. And so Mesopotamia and Egypt both are going to be fighting, struggling, wanting to have that piece of territory, and Israel and Judah are often going to get caught in the middle. That may be what's happening here as Hosea attempts to first buy off peace from Assyria and then turn to Egypt. We're going to note in a minute when we look at Hosea what Hosea's opinion is about these efforts of Israel to align itself with other nations. So this is the context then in which Hosea is speaking. He may not be active until the end of the northern kingdom, finally in 722, but during the time when he is speaking, it is going to be a time of chaos. It is going to be a time when the Assyrians are coming and doing great threat, and when it's evident that they are getting ever closer and that their days as a nation are drawing to a close. Now, Hosea is not going to directly mention all of this chaos that's going on. He is more concerned with some of the religious matters of the northern kingdom, and particularly with the nation's worship of Baal. As we mentioned, he is going to talk about and criticize the tendency of Israel to try to align itself with a foreign nation for safety and security, and that for him is simply an example of unfaithfulness to Yahweh, that the people are trusting in other nations instead of trusting in God. So let's go on and take a look now at exactly what Hosea is going to be talking about. If you'll open to the book of Hosea, chapters 1 through 3, we're going to have this extended metaphor in which Hosea is going to compare Israel's relationship with God to that of an unfaithful wife to her husband. He's going to be told to marry a prostitute, by the way, a prostitute by the name of Gomer, not to be confused, of course, with Gomer Pyle. Moreover, this couple is going to have 3 children, and the children are going to have symbolic names. The first child is going to be named Jezreel, as a memory of the terrible and violent coup at Jezreel that had been effected by King Jehu about a century earlier. The second child in verse 6 is going to be named Lo Ruhamah. If you have a footnote in your Bible, it probably tells you that it means not pitied or no mercy or something like that. Namely, God is no longer going to have mercy on the house of Israel. And then finally, the third child is going to be named Lo Ami, which means not my people. In other words, because of their unfaithfulness, Israel is no longer my people. By naming the child Lo Ami, not my people, Hosea is really announcing here that the covenant has been abrogated. You'll remember the central tenet of the covenant is that Israel would obey God, and God's side of that covenant is that God would be their God and they would be God's people. So now when the child is named Lo Ami, or not my people, that is an indication that the covenant has been invalidated. Let's look a little bit more at some of what we find in chapter 2 in particular. Here is where Hosea is going to be very clear about the criticism of the worship of Baal, and we are going to see how Baal functioned in their society. He's going to start out again in verse 2 of chapter 2, comparing the Israelites' infidelity to the infidelity of an unfaithful spouse. He says, "Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts." And then let's jump down to verse 5, where it shows how Baal has replaced Yahweh. "For their mother has played the whore, she who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers. They give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink." In other words, they are giving Baal, this Canaanite god of fertility, the credit for causing their crops to grow instead of giving the credit to Yahweh where it belongs. This is repeated in verse 8, where God says she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished upon her silver and gold that they used for Baal. In other words, again, they're giving Baal credit for causing their crops to grow. Verse 9, "Therefore I will take back my grain in its time and my wine in its season. I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness." In other words, God threatens that I'm going to withhold all fruitfulness and productivity from the land until the people can remain faithful and recognize where it is that their prosperity comes from. More than that, he goes on to say in verses 11 to 12, "I will put an end to all her mirth, her festivals, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed festivals." In other words, God is going to bring destruction as punishment for their unfaithfulness to Yahweh. Let's go on and take a look at just a few more highlights of Hosea, more expressions of Israel's sin, particularly in chapter 4 through 14. We're going to see again that idolatry is going to be mentioned fairly regularly. I'd encourage you to take a look, for instance, at chapter 5, verses 3 through 7. And then jump down also to chapter 6, verses 4 through 6, where Hosea is going to make the remark that Israel's fidelity has only been short-lived and she cannot be relied upon to remain faithful to God. "What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes away early. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets, I have killed them by the words of my mouth." One of the interesting features of Hosea is that it uses a lot of similes and metaphors to describe God. And here's an instance of using the morning cloud or dew to describe the fidelity of Ephraim, of the northern kingdom. In other words, their faithfulness is no more reliable than the morning dew, which goes away as soon as the sun comes out. In other words, we can also look at chapter 8, where this is placed into covenant language. Verse 1 of chapter 8, "One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have broken my covenant." The next thing that they are going to complain about is the reliance of Israel on foreign nations. We see several times throughout scriptures that reliance on other nations is something that leads to idolatry and is seen as almost as bad as idolatry because it really is trusting in something other than God. In chapter 5, for instance, beginning with verse 8, we have some more oracles of disaster against Ephraim. And down in verse 13, it tells us, "When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to the great king." So we've already seen how some of the Israelite kings were attempting to buy off the Assyrians by showing loyalty to them and securing their safety that way. And of course, that is exactly what Hosea says is the essence of idolatry. The same thing is going to be clear in chapter 7, verses 11 through 13, where it is going to say that Ephraim has become like a dove, silly and without sense. They call upon Egypt, they go to Assyria. again, seeking safety in reliance on other nations. And once again, we also have a very interesting metaphor that is used here to describe Ephraim and its faithfulness or lack thereof. However, Assyria cannot save, as Hosea goes on to say in chapter 14, verse 3. Assyria shall not save us, we will not ride upon horses. We will say no more, our God, to the work of our hands, in you the orphan finds mercy. Assyria will not save us. What's more, Hosea is going to have special criticism for the religious leaders, the priests, who should know better, but apparently they are not being faithful, and they are not encouraging Israel to follow Yahweh either. In chapter 4, for instance, beginning in verse 4, God says, "Yet let no one contend, and let none accuse, for with you is my contention, O priest. You shall stumble by day, the prophet also shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother." So both the priests and the prophets are not holding the nation accountable for fidelity to God. In fact, they are probably participating in the infidelity that's taking place, and so a special punishment, in a sense, will be reserved for them. In verse 6, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge," he says to the priests, "because you have rejected knowledge. I reject you from being priests to me, and since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children." One of the important jobs of the priest is to officiate at the temple cult, but another important job is to teach the people the Torah, or the law, and obviously these priests are falling short there. Now, Hosea is going to summarize all of this disobedience by pointing out that the covenant has been broken. He reminds us of the covenant and its basis in chapter 11, verse 1. "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." In other words, God has chosen for himself a people. He has led them out of Egypt and made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. Yet what is their reaction going to be? As verse 2 tells us, "The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to the idols." The rest of this chapter is interesting. Well, it brings up yet another one of those fascinating metaphors that Hosea uses. He says, "Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness and with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them." In other words, God has been like a parent to his people, yet they have reacted only by disobeying and being disloyal to him. The description of God's emotional reaction in verses 8 through 9 is fascinating as well. In spite of all their disobedience, he says, "How can I give you up, O Ephraim?" Just like you may have known parents who refuse to give up on their children, who have caused many days of sorrow and anguish. In verse 9, "I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath." And so you'll remember we said that in Amos, everything is negative. It's all destruction. We said that was atypical for the prophets because most prophets are going to combine oracles of hope or promise with oracles of judgment. And this is a perfect example of that right here. In other words, God is not going to give up on his people, on Ephraim. Chapter 13, verses 4 to 6, are also going to mention the covenant, reminding the people that God is the one who fed the people in the wilderness and made them satisfied, and yet they forgot God. And so in verse 7 of chapter 13, "I will become like a lion to them, like a leopard I will lurk beside the way." So here an example of an oracle of destruction or disaster. Let me close then by reminding you of something that I said at the end of the lecture on the Davidic promise in 2 Samuel 7. You'll remember we said that the Bible is kind of what we might call a tale of two mountains, Sinai and Zion. Sinai and Zion, remember, was the name of the book by John Levinson that I cited. In other words, the two major traditions in the Old Testament are going to run parallel to one another. The Sinai covenant, God's covenant with the people, reminding them that they must be obedient and that if they don't, they will suffer punishment. The Zion tradition that is going to emphasize the safety and the security of Zion and of the Davidic family within Zion having an eternal dynasty. A lot of these prophets are going to be based in either one or the other of these traditions. And here we see that Hosea is based very much in the Sinai tradition. Repeats a lot of the things that we heard in the covenant with Moses. And so a lot of people have suggested indeed that Hosea kind of comes from the same group of family, or the same group of people rather, that would eventually produce the Deuteronomistic history, the book of Deuteronomy, and so forth. Keep on listening to the next lecture in this module. We're going to take a look at Isaiah, and that will give us an opportunity to compare Hosea from the Sinai tradition with Isaiah, who is going to be speaking more from the Zion tradition. Thanks for joining me today, and it's great to have you with me. Please let me know if you have any questions.